podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, Editor-in-Chief of TNSR, Will Inboden, and Ashlyn Hand, a PhD candidate at the LBJ School at the University of Texas in Austin, speak with Lauren Turek, professor at Trinity University, about her new book, To Bring the Good News to All Nations, Evangelical Influence on Human Rights in U.S. Foreign Relations. American foreign policy has often had a strong religious component, whether that be in the form of manifest destiny or the idea of American exceptionalism. But as Turek documents, in the late 20th century, the specific notion of human rights intersected with evangelical missionaries and their perceptions of the risks attendant with communism and other important foreign policy questions, and they were able to organize and influence U.S. foreign policy in a new and important way. Let's listen in on this interesting conversation.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Horns of a Dilemma. I'm Will Inboden, Executive Director of the Clement Center for National Security, honored to be hosting our discussion today. And our special guest is Professor Lauren Turek of Trinity University in San Antonio, who has just written a fantastic new book with Cornell University Press, To Bring the Good News to All Nations, the subtitle Evangelical Influence on Human Rights and U.S. Foreign Relations. Also, as part of our discussion today, we have Ashlyn Hand, who is a PhD student here at the University of Texas and also currently a doctoral fellow with the Kissinger Center at Johns Hopkins SAIS. So, Ashlyn, great to have you with us as well. For our listeners, let me just say why I'm so excited to be talking with Lauren and Ashlyn about these subjects, and particularly featuring this book today. I think this book is a model of how to do careful, sensitive, balanced scholarship on what can be some pretty contentious issues. Lauren is addressing religion and foreign policy, two things you're not supposed to bring up at the dinner table, right? She looks at some, pretty controversial episodes in American foreign policy history, including support for the genocidal regime in Guatemala, questions of South African apartheid, and of course, Cold War policy and communism and its human rights abuses and anti-communism. All these topics that can be quite fraught and emotive. And I'm just really struck in how Lauren put together this book of trying to understand the different actors she's writing about on their own terms. I think that's, first principle of careful historical scholarship. Tying it in some insightful ways to the contemporary policy moment without getting at all tendentious or polemical, and really interweaving grassroots religious politics and activism with overseas religious communities, overseas Christian communities, and then high matters of statecraft and policy in Congress or the State Department or the White House. So any one of those is a real challenge. And the way Lauren weaves all of them together in a really balanced way makes this just a tremendous book that I'm glad it's out now, and I know people are going to be reading it and talking about it for years and decades to come. So anyway, Lauren, very well done.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me.
So we're going to do a conversation about the book. Ashlyn and I will be alternating with some questions and observations. Let me start with the beginning. How did you get the idea to do this research project and turn it into this really interesting book?
That's a great question. So I, of course, started off working on this project while I was in graduate school, and I had been working on a master's thesis that looked at the emergence of opposition to President Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviet Union. And I was very surprised to see, among the groups that articulated opposition to this policy, a number of evangelical Christians. Because in my mind, evangelical Christians were very active on hot-button domestic social issues like abortion and prayer in school, but I hadn't really necessarily thought about their engagement on foreign policy issues outside of, say, Israel. That's what we usually read about. And here they are, really active in this policy against détente, and they're using a lot of human rights language, and I found that quite surprising. So when the time came to pick a dissertation topic, I said, this seems like something that has not been written about very much that is very engaging. And so I started to look into moments where evangelicals were advocating on human rights policies, advocating on issues of religious freedom, advocating for policies with regards to other parts of the world that surprised me. And so that's the origin of the book project. And of course, as I went and did more research, I was able to better develop this broader argument about evangelicals developing a particular human rights vision and then attempting to implement it through their foreign policy lobbying during the 1970s and 1980s.
And I actually love the continuity there, of course, because one of the key opposition vehicles for détente was the Jackson-Vanik amendment about MFN, most favored nation and freedom of immigration. And you then come back to that in the 1980s when the evangelical lobby uses that against Romania.
And indeed, they are very inspired by the efforts that Jewish groups mount in the 1970s to push for the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, to push for hinging most favored nation status on the rights that religious groups have within countries abroad to emigrate or to practice their faith freely. So their evangelicals are looking at those events and saying, hey, why aren't we advocating for our Christian brethren abroad the way that these Jewish groups are? So they really take it as a starting point.
I agree entirely. First, thanks to both of you for letting me join the conversation today. But I agree that this is an understudied issue, so I was excited to see your book, and I'm thankful for your having decided on the topic. And I wondered, kind of as we get started, if you might define what you mean or what's included in evangelicals or evangelicalism as you talk about it in the book.
Yes, this is such a great question because, of course, one of the big issues in religious studies is how do we define what an evangelical is? How do we define religion? These are areas of hot debate. I am primarily a historian of U.S. foreign relations. I'm not a religious studies scholar. So I didn't want to get too bogged down in that actual debate about what is an evangelical. But I obviously needed to think pretty hard about which individuals and groups to include in the book. So I had to engage with that to a reasonable extent. So I looked at a lot of definitions that scholars of religious studies have provided. And I ultimately decided that the one that made the most sense for me was one from a sociologist named Mark Shibley. And he gave a definition that looked at both practice and belief as being integral to what he defined as an evangelical. So folks who, it's kind of a broad group, folks who have had a born again experience. So they have a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. People who accept the full authority of the Bible in matters of faith as well as in their everyday lives. And most crucially, people who are committed to spreading the gospel by bearing a public witness to their faith. And this definition, which I'm more or less quoting from, that is such a capacious yet straightforward definition. It addresses practice and belief. It accounts for this incredible diversity that evangelicals have in terms of their practices and beliefs, but it also takes individuals at their word. It allows for evangelical self-definition, which is really in keeping with the individualistic nature of evangelical churches. There's not this kind of hierarchy like they have in, say, the Catholic Church. These are more diffuse, more individualistic. It also really emphasizes evangelism, and going out into the world is such a key piece of understanding the evangelical relationship with foreign policy making. So that seemed central. And of course, evangelicalism is just incredibly diverse, right? There are different expressions that vary by race, by region, by culture. I wanted the broadest definition possible. So what I did then, having that definition in mind, I moved to focus on both individual believers as well as groups. So denominations like the Baptists, or non-denominational or parachurch organizations. So a variety of missionary organizations. Any group that I could see that was defining itself in some way as evangelical that then exerted influence on policymaking. So I'm not writing about all evangelicals because some evangelicals were not super engaged in foreign policy activism. But groups like the National Association of Evangelicals certainly were. I also wanted to be broad enough to encompass Pentecostals and charismatics and non-denominational Christians. So I didn't just want to write about this particular flavor of evangelicalism. So I tried to be as broad as possible while focusing on the key elements of evangelicalism as well as who was most active in foreign policy.
One of the things we want to do is encourage all of our listeners to buy and read your book. Okay, this is my preface, my next question. Again, for everyone, it's by Lauren Turek, To Bring the Good News to All Nations. That said, realistically, not everyone will be able to buy and read the book. Give us kind of a 2 to 3 minute summary of the main points, the main contours of your argument before we go into some of the details and the cases. Give us the elevate. Give our listeners the elevator pitch on what's your main argument here.
Sure. So basically, the sort of core argument that I make in the book is I'm telling the story of how and why politically conservative and predominantly white evangelical groups in the United States become very influential as a foreign policy lobbying group in the 1970s. I start by explaining the spiritual and ideological beliefs that motivated evangelicals to engage in foreign policy activism. I explore how they become effective as foreign policy advocates. And then I provide some regional examples that show that lobby at work. And what I found and what I talk about in the book is that the causes that these evangelical activists took up in the 1970s reflected this blend of political and spiritual beliefs that came together to define a new conservative Christian foreign policy and human rights agenda. And I argue that evangelicals were particularly motivated by this desire to fulfill the Great Commission, or their scriptural mandate to go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation and to make disciples of all nations. So they believed that they had this biblical duty to evangelize and to spread their faith worldwide. And they became increasingly anxious about accomplishing this in the 1960s and 70s because they believed that the parts of the world where the population was growing fastest, so the global south, Africa, Asia, Latin America, etc., that those parts of the world did not have enough Christians or missionaries to do the job, to meet the task. They often said in their meetings that there are 2 billion people in the world who have been unevangelized, they're unreached, and they really want to reach out to those people to fulfill their mission. But they're stymied by countries that are closed to evangelism or that are persecuting religious minorities. So there's this revival in efforts to evangelize, some of which comes through technology, radio and satellites to broadcast into hostile areas. But there's this new sort of renewed effort to do missionary work and to, most importantly, network with evangelicals that were in those foreign countries to get them to do more to evangelize their countrymen. So this global evangelical network emerges in the 1970s, and evangelicals are in communication with evangelicals throughout the world, and they start to become more attuned to what's happening abroad. They start to hear about persecution in their mission fields. Now, these evangelicals see that persecution as a threat to their effort to evangelize the world, and because of that, they start to lobby Congress to take action to promote their vision for religious freedom, their vision for human rights abroad. They testify in Congress. They try to advocate for aid to countries that they think are promoting religion or to restrict aid to those that are not. And the vision that they promote is one that is very sort of unique to a sort of conservative human rights vision, in contrast to the liberal human rights vision that we think of with, say, an Amnesty International. What's really significant is that their core arguments are very influential in Congress, and they come to define a human rights vision that is key in shaping U.S. human rights policy during the Reagan years, but also beyond.
I'm amazed at the combination of the depth and the clarity of your argument throughout the whole book. That's a hard combination to find, and I think you do a masterful job laying it out.
Thank you.
One of the things that I was most interested in, and I would say this is especially true in the early chapters of the book, is the attention you gave to the tensions that existed within the evangelical community, both respect to the nature of the mission itself, but also to the way that you go about achieving it. I wonder if you might speak some more to those tensions and how they evolved over the 60s and into the 70s.
Yeah, one of the things that I do is I spend a lot of time in the first chapter of the book talking about a really important conference that Billy Graham organized and held in 1974 that brought together evangelicals from all over the world. The goal of the meeting was about that perceived crisis that there's this huge population growth in the global south, and we need to make sure we're getting out to evangelize. And so Graham brings all of these evangelicals from all over the world to meet in Lausanne, Switzerland. And the idea is that they're going to articulate this plan for a strategy that evangelicals can collaborate on so that they can go out and evangelize the world. And they are very surprised when some evangelicals from the global south, including the Ecuadorian theologian C. René Padilla, they're very critical of U.S. evangelism. They're critical of U.S. evangelicals, and they actually call them cultural imperialists. They really kind of and it's not that they don't share Graham's vision. They want to evangelize too. What they're concerned about and where this rift is that develops is that they see the U.S. counterparts as being as ignoring many of the structural problems in their countries. They're ignoring social justice issues. They're ignoring the problem of poverty. And they're saying there's no way that we can evangelize effectively if people are living in poverty. And evangelicals in the United States are not as receptive to those, conservative evangelicals in the United States are not as receptive to those social justice concerns. They really emphasize the idea that you need to evangelize people. They need to hear the word in order to have freedom, that promise of salvation after death is the primary function and everything else is secondary. So there's this rift, and it's not that evangelicals in the US don't care about hunger or anything else. They certainly do, but they see the evangelistic goal as primary, whereas the folks in the global South are saying we really need to be attentive to social justice issues. And so both of those pieces end up in this Lausanne Covenant that comes out from the conference. But we see that the tension between those two sides persists throughout the 1970s and 1980s. So it's this really interesting rift that develops. It also shapes the missionary strategy. Evangelicals in the United States and the West come to say, oh, we really do need to be concerned about the issue of cultural imperialism. We need to try to ensure that more evangelicals and missionaries are indigenous or local to those areas. We can't necessarily be sending all U.S. evangelicals down unless there's no one else around. So they start to be more attuned to the issues of kind of avoiding cultural chauvinism. They talk about that explicitly. They're not always successful, but they're thinking about it at least.
Well, Lauren, if I can follow up on a few of those trends you identify, and again, I loved the prominence you give to the Lausanne conference there, because again, it's one of those things that is hugely important in religious history and world history, but it's just so little known about or remembered today. So it seems to me, taking the big picture with your book, it seems that there are 5 big trends going on in the world in these decades you're writing about, in the 70s and early 80s. And you do a masterful job of weaving those together. So I just want to kind of highlight for our listeners what it seems those 5 big trends are, and would love to hear your reflections more on how you balanced weighing these. So there's 2 big religious trends. There's the expansion of evangelical political activism in the United States, right? This is also the decades of the rise of the religious right and just, burgeoning evangelical activism. But then globally, as you were just talking about, you've got the global expansion of evangelicalism. I mean, and Philip Jenkins and others have done some really interesting work on this, but kind of the average demographic profile of a world evangelical Christian completely shifts over 50 years, where now the average demographic profile is it's a 25-year-old Chinese woman or a 25-year-old African woman. It's not the stereotypical 45-year-old white American male. And I love how you bring them in. But then politically, there's the 3 big trends. There's globalization and the communications revolution, sweeping the world in the 70s and 80s, and you track with that. Then there's if you might call it, the democratization of American foreign policy, especially with Congress getting so much more involved, whether it's, again, Jackson Vanik, whether it's the Church and Pike Commission hearings to bring more congressional oversight on the intelligence community, whether it's just growing congressional activism on human rights overall. And that, of course, is where Congress becomes a conduit for other passions. And then finally, in the Cold War, I think Arnie Westhead and others have really shown that the 70s is when the Cold War really becomes a global conflict. Now, it had been before. There had been the seeds of it before, but this is where, whether on the Soviet bloc side or the American bloc side, both sides are just dramatically expanding their activities, their presence in Africa, Latin America, Asia. So all those different trends are coming together in this really interesting story you're telling here. How did you weave those together? I mean, how do you do that? Any one of those could be a book in its own right.
Yeah, from a sort of structure of the book standpoint, I tried to do a kind of a set of overlapping chapters. So what is the story in global religion? So I can tackle that question and bring in issues of decolonization, which are also key to that global Cold War story, to think about questions of imperialism and U.S. power. And then I can overlay that on a question of, okay, so evangelicals want to do more. They want to be a network. How did they do that? Well, the revolution in technology with radios, satellites, et cetera, that provides a vehicle for greater connection. And it's not just one-way communication, it's two-way communication, right? So that's another story. And I can layer that over the story then of the rise of the religious right and the increasing political power that evangelicals have in the United States, but also the conflicts in Congress, to think about a Congress that is increasingly uncomfortable with what they see as a potentially imperial presidency, a Congress that's very concerned about human rights, but a moment in time when the idea of human rights itself is not clearly defined and is being defined as folks work through what human rights mean. So it's an idea in flux. So there's an opportunity for conservative political activists, for evangelicals, to seize the term human rights and to provide their own definition that can become influential. So we have that picture, but then we can go out and we can actually see, what does this look like in the context of a global Cold War? What does it look like, not just in bilateral relations with the Soviet Union, but in relations with areas that the presidential administrations like the Reagan administration see as particularly significant, like Central America? How does religion map on? What about South Africa, which is a country that the U.S. has would like to maintain a close relationship with, that seems like a potential anti-communist bulwark in Southern Africa, and yet is also home to an incredibly repressive racist regime, and there is a tremendous amount of protest in Congress about that. How do all these pieces then square? And then what I do is I show how evangelicals, both on the ground in those countries and in the United States, play on those issues, involve their activism and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the approach. So some of it was just picking case studies that seem to hit some of those hot spots, but also picking case studies where activism looks different and the outcomes are different. They're sometimes successful. They are sometimes not successful, but still influential. And they sometimes they have kind of a mixed outcome, but they're players. So the idea in the book is not to say evangelicals are the prime explanation for X and Y foreign policies, because there's never a monocausal explanation, but just to say that here's a group that really was influential in these ways at these moments, and they're worth paying attention to.
And I really appreciate the quite disparate case studies you have. I mean, Guatemala, the Soviet Union, South Africa, those three, the main ones, really diverse geopolitically, geographically, Cold War-wise, and in outcomes. But that, I think, helps strengthen the argument. So,
Lauren, I wanted to return briefly to the language question you just brought up. I thought that was such an important piece of your argument. Sometimes you found political opponents in the case studies themselves, political opponents both using the term human rights or justifying their policy prescriptions in the name of human rights, but ending up in really different places. And so I wondered if you could expand on kind of how did the definition of human rights evolve in the evangelical context, and how is that different maybe than more traditional or more secular views of human rights might be?
Yeah, this is why starting with ideas was so critical. Starting with evangelical beliefs was so critical, because what I found is that for evangelicals, it was the freedom of religion or freedom of conscience that becomes that kind of primary human right. And that is rooted very much in evangelical beliefs about the goal of achieving the Great Commission, right? If they believe that it's their spiritual duty to spread the gospel, and they want a foreign policy that will protect not just their freedom to evangelize, but the freedom of the unreached to hear the gospel and the freedom of others to evangelize. So there is no earthly privation that would compare to this loss of potential eternal salvation through hearing the gospel. And so they advocate primarily for religious liberty. This is in contrast to what we might think of as more expansive human rights ideas from secular or politically liberal organizations, right? Those would be rights to bodily integrity or rights to certain economic justice, those kind of ideas. But by focusing specifically on freedom of conscience or religious freedom, you get a limited but very specific conservative vision for human rights, one that is rooted in those spiritual beliefs and is very much connected to what we might think of as broad human rights, right? It's in the Universal Declaration, or the UDHR, the Declaration on Human Rights. But it's also really interesting because it is a right, many of the evangelical groups will define it, this is a right that comes not from the state, but it's a right that comes from God. And they kind of look to the idea that man is created in the image of God to say everybody has a certain dignity, certain set of rights, religion being a primary one. So these ideas are then woven together, and this comes up in a lot of the different parts of scripture that they cite when talking about this. But it's a very sort of cohesive set of ideas that emerges.
Lauren, let's talk a little bit more about the two presidencies who are most featured in this, the Carter administration, especially the Reagan administration. But I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time on the Carter administration too. But tell us about what you learned about those two presidencies through this particular prism. And just to tee it up a little bit, one thing I was struck by is, on the one hand, yes, the conventional wisdom is correct that evangelical support was very important for the Reagan administration, and there was overall a decent amount of alignment. Reagan was also personally committed on religious freedom promotion and anti-communism, right? And of course, Carter, one of the most visible early American evangelical presidents. At the same time, your book tells some complexities there. I mean, even thinking about Central America, Reagan administration's main priorities were El Salvador and Nicaragua, and so they weren't as into Guatemala as the groups you're near. But then the Iron Curtain chapter points out how Reagan was really at odds with a lot of evangelical groups over Romania and the MFN question. And of course, South Africa was also complex too. So anyway, just tell us more about what you learned about those two presidencies and how they navigated this sometimes support, sometimes opposition.
Yeah, what I thought was really interesting is that the evangelicals I studied initially were excited about Carter. They thought he was going to be a great supporter of religious freedom and evangelicalism. And even though he did negotiate the releases of some religious prisoners, which I talk a bit about in the book, he's ultimately disappointing to evangelicals. They were disappointed that he relied on quiet diplomacy with the Soviet Union and that he took this very hard line against authoritarian regimes. And so many of the criticisms that Reagan levied against Carter, that, he's alienating our allies, our authoritarian allies, and he's, being, not doing enough to stand strong against the Soviet Union. Those are criticisms that evangelicals come to lobby as well. But that doesn't mean that they're lockstep with Reagan. There's this interesting relationship that develops between evangelicals and Reagan where they can be mutually supportive. Reagan seems like, when he comes into office, that he may be very supportive to their aims. And I think Reagan recognizes that evangelicals by the 1980s are a more reliable voting bloc that may be useful in terms of providing moral support to his arguments. But Reagan also has some priorities that don't always align with evangelical priorities. And the case of Romania that you mentioned is one that I talk about in the book that I think is a really interesting one, because Reagan is trying to pursue a policy of differentiation in the Soviet bloc, in the Eastern European bloc, where he wants to reward countries that will be somewhat independent from the Soviet Union with better trade and better relations. And evangelicals are looking at Romania and saying, this is one of the most abusive, repressive countries to Christians and Christian dissidents. How can this be? And so they are very resistant to Reagan's efforts to extend most favored nation status, to improve relations, which puts them at cross purposes. So they are not just lockstep with Reagan. And I think that's one of those interesting moments where we see that this is not just about anti-communism or about going along with a conservative president. It's really rooted in what is going to be best for promoting religious liberty in those countries.
Yeah, no, the Romania one's a great example of where the Reagan strategy was to try to turn Romania into another Yugoslavia,
Exactly.
essentially, distant, and but Romania with a large evangelical and Baptist population, American evangelicals thought otherwise.
Well, and what's so interesting, of course, is that what we see is evangelicals go and testify about what's happening in Romania, and then we see legislators repeating their stories in other hearings. So that's one of those cases where you can really trace the transmission of ideas from evangelicals to actual hearings and policy discussions that occur after they're gone.
Yeah. So that's catnip for historians when we can prove that elusive causality. Yeah.
It's such a challenge. Yeah.
A little bit of a follow-up on that. I wondered to what degree did domestic political mobilization affect those two presidents and across the three case studies? Did you find that more in one versus the other, perhaps more in a particular case study there too?
So there's a few things happening that I think are very interesting, because of course I looked at evangelical lobbying over a longer period. So I looked in the Nixon administration too, and there's very little conversation from the Nixon administration about evangelicals other than because at that point in the early 70s, they're not fully organized as a bloc, and he sees them in an instrumental way, but not as a particularly important one. Carter sets up an office, a sort of a leader of religious liaison in the White House that takes a particular interest in communicating with evangelicals and, of course, a range of other religious groups. So there's this recognition by the late 70s that there needs to be some kind of concentrated work with religious groups. That being said, that continues in the Reagan era and just intensifies because, of course, the Reagan administration does see evangelicals as being an important potential voting bloc. Though the other piece of this, of course, is that we see in this era the National Association of Evangelicals actually establishing a lobbying presence in Washington, one that it didn't really have before. So there's also just greater politicization among these evangelical groups. We're seeing evangelicals elected to Congress and being very open about their connections with domestic groups like Focus on Family or the Moral Majority or other domestic evangelical groups. There's also the significance of evangelical TV programs like the 700 Club and others like that can really amplify the message. And they will often talk about foreign policy issues. So I have a chapter on U.S. evangelical involvement in Guatemala, and we see that folks are coming on to the 700 Club, talking with Pat Robertson about the need to support this evangelical dictator and send him money or donations so that he can fight his fight against insurgents. So the domestic really does matter. It's a key source of fundraising, a key source of consciousness raising, and then a source for letter writing, vigils, et cetera, that can then be a way to put pressure on legislators to do what they want to have done, which doesn't necessarily mean that that's what will happen, but they're there making noise and raising awareness about these issues.
Lauren, just a little vignette which reinforces a lot of your insights there about the more complicated relationship that the Reagan White House had with evangelicals. And this is all I'm going to say about my own work here, but I'm currently writing this history of Reagan administration foreign policy. And fascinating episode in January of 1984, the Reagan White House extends diplomatic recognition to the Vatican. So we actually hadn't had formal diplomatic relations with the Vatican for about the previous 100 years. Mostly because of church and state concerns and some of the kind of anti-Catholicism you had in large swaths of American society. But of course, Reagan had formed a pretty close partnership with Pope John Paul II. CIA and Vatican were cooperating, a lot of support for anti-communists behind the Iron Curtain. And so those networks were taking place. So Reagan decides, all right, let's make it official. Let's give them diplomatic recognition. And a couple days after the announcement about diplomatic relations, literally every major evangelical leader in the country, a bunch of the ones who are mentioned in your book, show up at the White House to meet with Bud McFarlane, National Security Advisor. Reagan didn't want to see them, furious over this diplomatic recognition of the Vatican. And Reagan had even tried to have Billy Graham, who quietly supported it, ameliorate them a little bit, tell them it was going to be okay, that kind of stuff. But they wanted nothing to do with it. They just thought that this was an outrage. It was recognizing the Catholic theocracy, if you will, so on and so forth. And it's politically complicated because January of 84, Reagan has just announced he's running for re-election, even though he later wins in a landslide. It was going to be, at the time, they thought it was going to be a tight race. And so he is potentially alienating a pretty important block of supporters there. Of course, it also helped him with the Catholic vote, so that can cut both ways. But anyway, it's another one of those things that shows the complexity of these relationships.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. That is such a fascinating example, and just the continued antipathy between evangelicals and Catholics, and thinking about especially their engagement in Central America, one of their interests in Rios Montt, the dictator who comes to power in Guatemala, he's an evangelical. He tells them he's going to turn Guatemala to God. Well, Guatemala is nominally Catholic, so they're eager to convert from Catholicism to evangelical as many of those folks as they can. So those tensions are still present in the 80s. That's so interesting though with the story of the Vatican. Yeah.
All right, I want to jump in here now, and I'm going to ask another question, but this one is as much directed to Ashlyn as it is to Lauren. Since Ashlyn, you are doing some really interesting research and work right now on American international religious freedom policy, kind of picking up where Lauren's book ends. If Lauren's book more or less ends in the mid-90s, Ashland's work is starting there and taking it up to the present day. So Ashland, tell us a little bit more about what you learned from Lauren's book and how it helps connect to the story you're working on about 21st century American international religious freedom policy and how evangelicalism shaped it.
I think, aside from it being a great book in its own right, it has also been incredibly helpful for me.
Thank you.
What Will said, just that it's kind of, I'm picking up the story after your conclusion. And so one thing that I've thought a lot about and learned some from your book was just that so many of the criticisms against international religious freedom that were levied as the act was passed, which Will was very much involved in that process in the 1990s, but the criticisms that continue today have their roots in the story that you outline in your book. So some of the allegations, and they're made often, I think, with varying degrees of fairness, is that international religious freedom is really only about promoting U.S. missionaries, or international religious freedom is really just the U.S. focusing on persecuted Christians, but it's limited in scope. So I think one of the challenges in the international religious freedom community has been how to evolve from what began, at least in large part, as a specifically evangelical movement into something that everyone, regardless of party persuasion, faith background, or lack thereof, can get behind. And so I think the movement has had a lot of success in this evolution, but it still has a lot of work to do. And so especially in the mid-90s, I think one thing I learned from this book was that this is at least the perception, if that makes sense. So regardless of what individual advocates are doing or the progress that's being made to make it more inclusive, and no doubt the tireless work of a lot of other faith communities and other activists who have gotten involved in international religious freedom work, this is still a big part of the history, and that's still lodged in a lot of people's minds. So to make sense of that, your book has been really helpful. So it's kind of that's the first thing that comes to mind there.
Thank you. One of the things that I think is really interesting in reading the political science literature about the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act is that one of the things I had noticed in my reading is that there was a sense of, boy, it was very surprising. There's some strange bedfellows here at this discussion. These evangelicals appear out of nowhere to this conversation. And so some of what I wanted to do with the book was exactly that, was to say they don't appear out of nowhere. There's this, as with anything, there's a long history that helps explain where they come from and why they're at the table. Why they're at the table with some really key Catholic activists too, actually, which is another interesting piece.
Sure. I think another thing that jumped out to me and that I'm still kind of working out in my mind and making sense of, but it's just the idea of, you talk about in your book as how evangelicals were focused on persecution first in the Soviet bloc, but that interest expanded in scope over time. And I think that's something trying to kind of get my mind around or figure out what the connections might be from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way through to today, is why does the United States get involved in preventing religious persecution in some places where it isn't doing that same thing elsewhere? And so the Reagan example that in Romania that you guys just brought up is a perfect example of that. But it's given me some tools to think through some of those tensions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we can think about, in this sort of contemporary moment, what's happening with the Uyghurs in China. These are questions of religious freedom that may get treated differently than, say, Christians in Syria or Christians in Iraq. And so there are these real questions that I think do animate these contemporary discussions. And my hope is having this longer history can help us contextualize what the priorities have been and how they can potentially be shifted.
Well, and Laura, that's a great segue to one of my last questions here. And I ask this mindful that you're a historian, you're not trying to be a policy pundit or things like that. And the history you tell is interesting in its own right. That said, do you find that your work, this history you tell, does it offer any either insights or maybe cautionary tales? I mean, you can take it in any number of directions for religious actors, evangelicals or other religious actors who are trying to shape American foreign policy today.
I think it offers a number of potential lessons. One is that we shouldn't discount the potential power of grassroots activism. I think when people really are concerned about a particular issue, it is very easy to be cynical or to be pessimistic and feel at this present moment that maybe grassroots activism isn't working. But I think what we see in this case is that grassroots activism, although it didn't always lead to the specific outcomes that activists wanted, it did have an influence. It did shape the conversations, and it was important. And so for religious actors, and they don't just mean evangelicals here, I mean broadly people who are concerned about questions of religious liberty, religious freedom worldwide, that activism matters. It's, it clearly was key in putting in place at least some structures in the State Department to pursue religious liberty as part of U.S. policymaking. That's significant. So grassroots activism matters, but we should also be really attentive to the way that we frame our language, right? The way that evangelicals framed their language on religious freedom or religious liberty was very limited, very narrow. Their human rights language is very narrow. And we might think about if ideas in U.S. foreign policy matter, if U.S. ideals matter, we want to perhaps be as capacious as possible, not quite so limited. So, I mean, that's me as a person speaking. But we can see that human rights language, the language of religious liberty, it's very malleable. You can use it to a lot of different ends. You can use it to pursue a wide range of policies. And so to be very careful about definitions and to try to be as pluralistic as possible in one's approach.
I have a question in general over your process on that. I wondered over the course of your research if there's something that really surprised you in the story that you unraveled.
There were a few things. So some is just the continuity of language, which I find that fascinating. Obviously, I talked a lot about that today. Just seeing language pop up in a constituent letter and then in a memo between the State Department and the White House, or from a hearing to legislation, right? Just that continuity of language. But I was also surprised by the reach that some U.S. evangelicals had. I discuss in my chapter about the Soviet Union and the breakup of the Soviet Union that an evangelical group from the U.S. gets invited to come to the Soviet Union to talk to the KGB and to talk to them about how to foster civil society in the Soviet Union. This is remarkable. And then members of the KGB, former members, go to Tennessee to meet with the Church of God to talk more about, and members of the Army to go to talk about how they can improve civil military relations. This is striking and not something I had read about elsewhere. And so I was very surprised to discover it being reported in the Columbia, Tennessee newspaper. So there are these moments where you say to yourself, oh, they really have this global reach and they're attracting attention abroad, even if that's not necessarily breaking through into the consciousness at home. Because one of the things that's interesting is sometimes when we read about evangelicals and foreign policy, some of the books have said, well, they're not really, they're influential on X or Y issues, but we're not really in these other ways. And you say, well, that may not be true when you actually look at it as a global story, or their influence might be happening in different registers.
All right, Lauren, final question from me, and this is both a kind of a policy, political, and methodological one. One of my perpetual themes with my faculty colleagues and students is how underappreciated Congress is as an important actor in American foreign policy. And speaking as a former congressional staff member, but also former executive branch policymaker, the mutual disdain between both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue is something to behold. And this is not a partisan comment at all. I mean, it doesn't matter who's in either of those. And I remember the line I would often hear at the NSC or State Department is when Congress is getting involved is, you've got 535 total members of Congress, House and Senate, and each of them thinks they should be Secretary of State. But we only got one Secretary of State, and they just need to, butt out. And there's something to that, with apologies to our congressional listeners here. That said, I'm also one who is a pretty strong Article 1 person, and thinks constitutionally and policy-wise, Congress does have an important role to play. And what you're describing here is, this real upsurge in congressional interest and activism on foreign policy. What surprised you there? Any takeaways there? I mean, do you think that this is, again, a cautionary tale about the messiness of Congress getting involved? Or is it more of a salutary tale of like, hey, this is the branch of our government most close to the grassroots and public opinion, and even if they don't always get it right, they need to have a seat at the foreign policy table?
I would tend toward the sort of latter perspective, and I say that in part because of the restraint, the constraint that Congress was able to impose imperfectly, but the constraint that they imposed on the Reagan administration in its interventions, particularly in Central America, where we really do see a lot of support for, what happens in Guatemala is a genocide, right? And it's not the necessarily the primary focus of the U.S. administration, but what's happening in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and elsewhere, Congress is able to pass laws that do frustrate the administration. And the Reagan administration took steps to go around Congress. So it's not as though Congress provides a perfect restraint on potentially dangerous policies, but it's an important check. It's important for the people to have a check on some of those behind the scenes issues that come up. And, your average American is not necessarily paying that much attention to foreign policy on a given day. Those of us who care are very vocal and very involved, but we're not that many. So if those folks are writing to Congress advocating for a foreign policy issue, Congress is going to be fairly responsive, not always, but generally. And so they can potentially shape policies that can help that. But there is this contest with the executive, and the executive has grown significantly stronger over the past, decades and decades now. So it's not an even fight.
Lauren, I have one kind of final question, if I may, Will. Thinking through, is this the book you thought you'd end up with? That's kind of the question I wanted to ask. If you think about how your arguments developed over time, is this the final product you envisioned, or not quite?
That is such an interesting question. I knew I was doing these case studies from the beginning. These are the 3 case studies I planned on. So in terms of those regions, yes. What I hadn't expected to spend so much time on was the technology side. So I didn't anticipate having a whole chapter about the globalization of technology in the 1970s. And that is something that I wrote, that was not in the dissertation, that is completely new to the book. It was fascinating to study that part of the story, to see the ways in which evangelicals are really early adopters of everything from satellite technology to the internet. There are particular spiritual dynamics that they use to describe their embrace of technology, which I think are fascinating, but also that they're really keen to involve local Christians. So it's not just U.S. Folks going in and setting up a radio station. They're going in and they're bringing in local people who speak a local language to tell these stories, to translate these ideas. If they're broadcasting into closed regimes, right, into China or into the Soviet Union, they're trying very hard to get programming that will resonate, not just with the Christians that are there, but also with people who might want an outside news source and just look to a U.S. broadcast in that way. Even though it's an evangelical and not an official one, they might see it as a kind of way to get outside news. So there's all of these interesting dynamics that come in with technology. And when I started writing the book, I certainly didn't anticipate that. But once I got into it, I was very excited to see the ways in which technology mattered in building a network and in raising awareness about what was happening.
Wonderful. All right. Well, our time is coming to a close. Lauren, thank you so much. And again, a reminder to our listeners, buy and read this great book, Lauren Turek, To Bring the Good News to All Nations.
Thank you so much for having me. This was such a great conversation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.